Hey, I'm Jim Search, and welcome to Understanding Upstate. It's a podcast dedicated to exploring what makes upstate New York such a unique place. Each week, my co-host Rob Adler and I dive into a new upstate topic to better understand what's up upstate. And today, we are drilling into a topic often not covered, the New York State oil boom. And that pun was for you, bud.
Wow.
Yeah. I did that for you.
Well done.
Yeah, of course. Now, before we jump in, I do want to say, for all our speedy freaks out there, for the OGs, obviously, welcome back. But for any new jacks here, jumping into this, subscribe, rate, review our show, share this episode with a friend. Share it with an enemy. You know what I mean? Who cares? Put a 5-star review in Apple Podcasts and let us know your favorite upstate location person in the review. And we may even shout you out for that. So please, by all means, get into that. Rob, it's been a minute. How are you?
It has. I mean, if you're a listener, you haven't missed a beat because we're pros. We're dropping these episodes every week. But it's been a couple weeks since we were on mic with each other, and we've got a big topic today to get into.
This is
but
huge.
Before we do, I've got an upstate update on a topic we covered a few months ago. I was doing some reading on today's topic of the New York State oil boom, and I came upon some information about a one William Avery Rockefeller Sr., who we talked about his son, William Rockefeller, and how he was a vindictive psychopath.
Yes.
And I think I have some information on how that came to be, because it turns out William Avery Rockefeller Sr. was also a goddamn lunatic.
Sure.
And explains a lot of his sons being William Jr. and John D. And their business strategies and lunacy in life. So would you like to learn about William Rockefeller, also known as Devil Bill? And I should say this ties into the larger topic of oil because, again, John D. and William started Standard Oil. It was like the biggest, probably, I would believe the biggest oil company I've ever seen, and also one of like the biggest companies that's ever existed in the world. And they're from upstate New York. William raised them, at least when he was around, in upstate New York. That was quite the fumbled introduction, but should we? Yeah. You want to learn a little bit about Devil Bill?
Yeah, let's talk about the impish man known as Devil Bill. Hit us with the facts here, Rob.
So he was a businessman by some people's definitions, but he's also a con artist, a horse thief, a fake doctor, snake oil salesman, a bigamist. He really checked a lot of boxes.
Oh, great.
So he basically worked as a traveling salesman, also was an actual lumberman, and he identified himself as a botanic physician, which is, again, to say a snake oil salesman. And he was known to buy and sell horses. We'll get to some quotes later.
Sure.
And he also, a large part of his business dealings was in land speculation. And he basically loaned money to farmers at 12%, which is high.
Sure.
But he targeted farmers that he thought couldn't pay back so he could foreclose and take their farms. Does that sound familiar, Jim?
That sounds like Tony Soprano, actually.
Oh, that too. But I was thinking William Jr., but also Tony Soprano.
Sure. Well, I've watched some of The Sopranos, and this is what we call loan sharking. And sprinkling a little bit of busting out of business. So yeah, all of which is illegal. by the way.
Tried and true tactics.
Sure. And this isn't only illegal, but also just like pretty immoral, because there's things that are illegal that aren't immoral. But this definitely checks both boxes of being against the law and also pretty shitty to do to someone who doesn't have a lot of money or options. But there's a reason why his name is Devil Bill.
It gets worse, Jim. So he had a grift back in his younger days where he would show up to someone's home with like a chalkboard sign that had written on it, "I'm deaf and I'm mute," and he would then like convince them that he had a magic elixir that made him allowed to speak and to hear. And one day he showed up at a house in Richford, New York, in Upstate, and he proceeded to go into this grift. And there was a young woman there named Eliza who was so charmed by him. She said, "I'd marry that man if he could actually hear and speak." So he proceeded to then probably have her look through a kaleidoscope, because that was part of his grift. He charmed people with this was like 1800s, Jim. Kaleidoscopes are like breaking technology.
Sure.
And he then convinced this woman against her family's wishes to marry her, and she would come to regret it later on.
What?
I've got a quote here from this lovely book which we've talked about before, Southern Tier Volume 2, which I'm going to read a little passage. So they get married, they have a home, and this is directly from this book. Tales were told of strange goings-on at the Rockefeller place, of a secret cave in a gully reached by a secret path where horses neighed and lanterns glowed of nights. A horse underground was operating in those days. Horses were stolen below the Mason-Dixon line and brought to upstate New York to be sold. When the underground began operating in both directions and missing New York State horses appeared in Dixie, upstaters formed vigilance committees and broke up the gangs. In 1850, 3 of Old Bill's cronies, or Devil Bill, were indicted for horse stealing. But despite Ida Tarbell's insinuations, she's a journalist. We'll get to her later. In her Standard Oil book, only one criminal charge was ever written on the record of John Dee's father, which, like, horse thief, that would get you killed back in the day.
Sure. I mean, it's like Grand Theft Auto today.
Yeah, man.
Steal my car, we got a problem.
So documented horse thief, selling horses to the Union and Confederacy.
No scruples, man.
Literally was going to say no scruples. Took the scruple out of my mouth.
There it is.
He once bragged to like a neighbor that, this is a quote, "I do business deals with my sons and I always try to cheat them to make them sharp." So, if you listen to our episode that talks about William and his vengeful crusade against a Civil War veteran named Oliver Lamora, like this, growing up in this household, it explains so much of their approach to life.
Sure, right, and like how, talk about like, I don't know, toxic parenting.
Yeah.
I beat them to make them strong. Really? I don't know. I don't know if that's how that all works, man.
No. So basically he then is later on accused of rape. He goes on the lam. Charges are brought up, but he escaped before anything could be brought to court. And then at this point, John and William are they're teenagers, I think early teens. Bill kind of comes in and out of their lives. He marries a 17-year-old girl, but doesn't divorce his first wife. So again, now he's a bigamist officially.
Sure.
At this point, he decides, I want to be a doctor. Why not?
Great. Well, he's done so much good for the world that it's a logical progression is let me see if I can heal people.
Let's see if I can pull this off. And the way he did it was he had like a really nice carriage. He had some really nice horses. So he pulls up into town looking like a fancy doctor. He could go get a room, the fanciest room at the fanciest hotel, and until, he looks successful.
Sure.
So, he would tell doctors to bring his patients or their patients to see him, and he basically had this doctor grift for years and years. Meanwhile, Standard Oil's taking off. John and William become super successful, and this journalist I mentioned before, Ida Tarbell, publishes like a 19-part series on Standard Oil and their history, and basically this is the start of kind of anti-Rockefeller sentiment, and kind of starts the breaking up of Standard Oil, antitrust, monopoly, all that fun stuff. But again, this is the first time this information becomes public, and like a media frenzy ensues trying to find out who he is, where is William Rockefeller.
Right.
I think he might have been in Cleveland or in Ohio under his fake doctor name. I think it's Dr. William Livingston.
Okay.
Real fancy doctor name.
A name you can trust.
Indeed. And Joseph Pulitzer offered an award of $8,000 for information on Doc Rockefeller. Again, huge media frenzy for a few years. No one ever really finds out any information. And 2 years after William dies, in 1908, they finally announce that he's dead and died, and it's published in a newspaper. So that's the origins of the more famous Rockefellers, and perhaps he's a more infamous Rockefeller.
Right.
I don't know.
This is important to kind of give like the backstory to two pretty heinous people who did some pretty heinous shit.
Yeah.
Where'd you get your inspiration? Well, my dad was awful.
It's a pretty clear, just like their crooked business dealings, any of it, just like William Jr. as he was, growing this crazy estate upstate. He's just doing the same shit his dad did to screw people out of their homes, right?
Yep.
It's a pretty clear connection.
You can draw a straight line.
Yeah, and they of course never talked about their dad publicly, and it was very much a skeleton in the closet. But speaking of bones, let's talk about some dinosaur bones that got turned into oil in New York State. Is that how it works?
It is, right? That's a separate episode and a separate,
sure.
separate lane. But you're right. That's how oil comes to be. That being said, the first recorded discovery of oil in North America was made in Allegheny County, which, to give our speedy freaks a frame of reference, 2 hours west of Binghamton. I'm landmarking all of this. How close are you to Binghamton?
I mean, landmarking it off of the center of the universe sounds like a very reasonable thing to do.
Yeah, totally sane, too. Totally reasonable, totally sane, well adjusted. All right, so in 1627, right, a French missionary was led to an oil sprig by local Seneca Native Americans, and that was a big mistake.
Yeah.
This is it's never historically been a good move to show anybody from Europe anything that could be worth money. Don't do it.
Don't
right?
do it. Yeah.
So the spring is located near what is now Cuba, New York. And fun fact, the Senecas used the oil for medicinal purposes and prized it as such. So smoking it, rubbing it, who knows? They're using it to get right, if you will. Now, New York State experiences an oil rush, which, again, I didn't know this coming in. I had no idea. There was an oil rush in New York State in the late 19th century. So, like, small towns grew by the thousands, and there's going to be a number that's going to kind of fuck us up in a little bit. I'm going to throw out there. And oil became the foundation of the local economy. And
this is like the first part of the first oil boom in the United States. Like, this is before Texas, Oklahoma. Like, this is it. And this is, like, I think you and I were talking about this a couple weeks ago. Like, this is why you have teams like the Pittsburgh Oilers, right? Like, Pittsburgh Oilers? Did I get the right city? Probably. I'm not going to fact check it. Anyway, this is where the oil industry effectively started. And at first, there was a well discovered in Titusville, Pennsylvania, in like 1859. And kind of the Appalachian region, like it expanded from there. And Titusville is not far from Western New York, Southern Tier. And that's why that's how we are discovering oil in mid 1800s.
And I think just critically thinking, you'll see why, like, the oil rush in New York State isn't as well known, right?
Yeah.
Because, and we'll get to kind of why that is in a little bit. But in 1865, Job Moses #1, located in Limestone, New York, becomes New York's first successful oil well at 7 barrels a day. So that's the first touchdown of oil. Now, there's a big oil strike at Rock City, which is southwest of Olean, New York, in 1877, and that marked the start of New York's first major oil field. Okay, so as time went on, the Triangle #1 near Allentown, drilled in 1879, causes the town of Petrolia, cleverly named. And that's funny. We're going to see, like, all this, like, how much of, like, oil impacts all these places, and how, like, I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but there's, like, a high school that has, like, an oil rig on the floor as you walk in, which is pretty wild. So in 1881, on a geologist's advice, an investor group drilled a well on the Redding Farm in Richburg, New York. The well came in at 70 barrels a day, which sparks the oil boom of 1881. Now, within days, okay, this is days, hundreds of people begin to flood into the valley, and then, which, like, you got to think, like, for that time, like, 100 people is like 2,000 by our standard, right? Yeah. Like, because there just aren't people, like, people aren't in mass, right?
There's also no train. There's no, I guess you can have, there's boats, right?
Sure.
If there's a river nearby, but, like, a little bit harder to get around too.
But yeah, like, so the fact that there were hundreds of people just coming through, because word spread so fast.
Yep.
Now, within 10 months, there were 10 to 12,000 people.
Jeez.
In, is it Bolivar? Did I say it right?
You see it and it looks like it's, Bolivar. But I saw pronunciation written out, and it's like Oliver, but with a B in the front. So I think Bolivar.
Well, we'll go with Bolivar. Let's do it. So there's 12,000 people in Bolivar, New York, in the late 1800s, which, again, is fucking wild to think about if you really go back in time to, like, what that looks like and how that feels. So that's like, I don't know, like 5 million people.
Yep.
So there's 7,000 people also go to Richburg, which is not too far. So like, you have, like, a booming, you can't even call it a metropolis because it doesn't have the infrastructure, right?
Yep.
So it's just like, there's just 10,000.
It's literally, I mean, not booming, but it's a boom town, right? Like, they literally get thrown up kind of overnight.
Yeah. And and it would be interesting, and I was trying to find it, is like all the kind of like ancillary like businesses that pop up around it, which I
read a little bit actually about it, where like that shit happened overnight. Like a businessman from Buffalo came down with a sack of $20,000 and set up a bank. Just like, all right, we're going to go make a bank. And then within like a month or a couple months, they had transactions up towards $250,000. Just like, oh, let's go build, like, yeah, let's go make a bank. There's oil. Great.
Let's do it. Right. So
did you read how oil was discovered in Bolivar?
It was a Confederate soldier.
He basically the oil was struck in Titusville at that first basically the first commercial well was struck there in Pennsylvania. It was called the Drake Well,
right?
Which we talked about a little bit a while before. So this like former Confederate soldier is just like, I want to get some of that oil money. So he goes to Bolivar and he sinks a few wells, hits nothing, asks his wife to sell all of her jewelry. She does. And they strike. Luckily for him, they strike oil.
I was going to say not only is his oil career short-lived, but he might have been short-lived himself had he not fucking struck some oil.
I think today's equivalent is, I was trying to think of this, like, I could not imagine asking my wife to sell some of her possessions, be like, I got a great idea for a podcast. We're going to strike it big.
Yeah.
Going out on a limb.
Which, boy, you better make sure it's right.
You better strike gold.
Yeah. Or die. Or you could just die. Yeah. So, like I was saying, oil becomes the bedrock of each town, right? Richburg and Bolivar. Bolivar dubbing itself the land of the deer and the derrick, as in like an oil derrick, and Richburg, the pioneer oil town. And as I was saying earlier, the Bolivar High School has a giant oil rig mural on the floor when you walk in. Okay. Now, this is what I wish I found more info on. And Speedy Freaks, if you got any intel, please fire it this way. The two villages, right, had gambling dens, bordellos, 36 saloons, and 12 billiard parlors.
The fucking Wild West.
Yeah, like you've turned Western New York into a mini Wild West California gold rush.
Vibe. Deadwood.
Right. Yeah. Like you got all types of wild shit going on, which would be incredible to find out what the stories were from that.
Ssomeone with a podcast should do something with
Yeah. You think, if someone had a podcast and they want to get more into that, that'd be great. Please let us know. Sure. Now, it's run. So the oil run, however, is very short lived. And I think that's why nobody really talks about this, because like if you look at like Texas and like Oklahoma and like, I mean, that is massive oil, right? Yep. There's oil barons afoot, right? So aside from the uptick in production during World War II, when the domestic oil industry was essential for the war effort, oil input in New York declined and thousands of wells, some a century old, were left behind with no existing owner on record. Now, that's not good.
No. Like, and the sense I get is there were a lot of independent wells too,
right?
Or smaller companies that maybe were under Standard Oil. Like there were just a lot of them spread out and across God knows how many different owners.
Yeah, like so it's a free for all, right? Yeah. Yeah. Now, these like these orphaned wells, right? That just no one has any checkup on, fell to the State Department of Environmental Conservation.
Mm-hmm.
If these are left unchecked, these oil wells, the EDF, the Environmental Defense Fund, said that unplugged wells can cause air pollution, contaminate groundwater, which totally makes sense, and release greenhouse gases. So there's a whole lot of this shit going on in Western New York.
Yep.
So since 2014, the department has plugged 360 abandoned or orphaned oil and gas wells, and the state has recorded roughly 7,300 orphaned wells. So now that's 10 years. Those numbers are 10 years old. Yep. So like they may be a little bit higher, maybe a little bit lower, but the fact remains that like these are everywhere. These are all over the place.
Like I'm literally looking at a map right now, and there's some counties where it's just like, I don't know, the bottom 20% of the county is just solid red. We're like, it's a teeny tiny dot for an orphaned or unplugged well. And like, there's some where it's like very diffuse, but like in kind of the western southern tier region, like there's a lot. I read one report where it's like, we may be underestimating this number by tens of thousands. Like there could be, it's a high likelihood that there's way more that we just don't know about.
Right.
And I read one account by a resident in the region where, like the water supply, like you mentioned, is contaminated, evidenced by the fact that they could get ignition from their water tap if they held a lighter near it.
Yo, that's you got to leave.
Yeah,
you got to go.
Not good,
right?
Not good.
Like that's about that. Is there's no you can't. Yeah, that's fucking terrifying.
Yep.
So, these unplugged wells are, across forest canopies, wetlands, on private properties, and it's a real shit show. So that is what I have for the oil boom, short-lived in Western New York. But Rob, I know that there's so much more to be talked about here.
Yeah, I got a little bit more. We can talk a little bit more about the kind of the decline. You'll notice that when the boom first started, we didn't have cars, right? So we're not chasing gasoline, right?
Right.
We're not trying to refine the oil for gasoline. It's more for kerosene, which was in high demand, but certainly not as high as what will become the demand for gasoline. So kind of the boom paired well with what the demand was for kerosene, but once automobiles come into place, like they need way more oil,
right?
Way more. And then again, you get these bigger claims in other parts of the country, and all the resources kind of shift over there. And you're talking about kind of the environmental impact. The oil didn't stay there, right? They basically, between like Standard Oil and the Olean Petroleum Company, had massive pipelines into Ohio and then into New Jersey for refineries, which and then also there's some refineries in Brooklyn, which were off the Newton Creek, which is one of the like most polluted waterways in New York State. And I was like, which I knew, but I was like, these it's from from the fucking oil industry and a bunch of other industries that were set up in Greenpoint, Brooklyn. But like it all flowed outward into New Jersey, other parts of New York State. And we're still dealing, not just people in Western New York whose taps are catching on fire, right?
God, like it's so wild.
These impacts are affecting people all across the country. And it's, Yeah, it kind of wild to see that this industry that started, well over 100 years ago and hasn't been productive for almost as long, has had these lasting environmental impacts.
And it's crazy because, I watched in preparation for this, I watched a news report from Western New York. Some news station did unusual stories of Western New York, and they talked about this. They talked about the oil boom, and there's a museum dedicated to this.
Yep.
And at the end of the segment, they were like, "There's still some people who are out there looking for oil." And you see these, I saw these dudes and they just looked yeah, my dad did it. His dad did it. And I'm going to do it. I don't know anything else.
That's an interesting segue because I was reading about an oiler named Paul Plants who he had started an oil company in 1970, which again, late to the game,
right?
Still some oil. I read an article from in the last few years, and it was as of 4 a.m. on January 1st in Texas has already produced more oil than New York State will this entire year. So
that's a fact?
Yes,
that's
literally
wild.
As a fact. There's so little oil there to this day. And that's not to say there actually in the 80s was kind of a gas boom. That's also since kind of tapered off. But there's this combined oil and gas kind of prospecting that goes on. But anyway, back to Paul Plants,
sure,
who was trying to get into the oil game in 1970. He has since converted his company to plugging the wells. He's I never thought that I would still be involved in the industry, but it would be plugging wells versus opening them, which I thought was an interesting, coming full circle. There's plenty of work to do in the oil industry. It's just, trying to make things a little bit safer and kind of wind things down versus ramping things up.
I mean, hey, look, if you can get the work.
Yeah.
Right? Somebody wants to pay for it and you have some wherewithal or know-how how to handle it. But it is kind of wild that the 70s he was like, yeah, you know what? Let me jump into this. Let me jump into this.
I mean, there was an oil crisis, right? In the 70s.
There was
oil shortage. You get some crazy ideas, I guess.
Late to the game.
Well, they had a shortage of oil in the 70s, but we don't have a shortage of great topics on this podcast. What are we going to be talking about next week?
Damn, you know what, Rob, when it comes to a fucking segue, dude,
not all the time.
Well, that was, you got us out of that real quick, and I love it. So next week, I'm very excited to bring something a little different here to the podcast for Understanding Upstate. We've talked a lot about history, as this episode, the oil boom, some crazy shit that's happened in upstate New York in the past. But we want to talk about the present, and we want to talk about what's going on with some folks that are really doing some great shit right now. And I'm talking specifically about my man LaRue Simmons over at Stellar Human. It's a really dope vintage store in Binghamton, New York. And we're going to be lucky enough to get to sit down and talk with him for a little bit, just about
live from upstate. You're going to be upstate. I'm going to be in the store. Yeah. In the store, Stellar Human, in-store interview, talking to LaRue about how he got into vintage clothing, his decision to bring this to Binghamton, New York, and his story. He's got a very cool story that we're very excited to bring to you. And, he just, the store just celebrated a 3-year anniversary, recently. So shout out to them. So
we're very excited to, again, I can't say how awesome this interview is going to be, but that's what's coming next week, folks. So
Nice.
Buckle in.
Looking forward to it. You know what else I'm looking forward to?
I don't.
I'm looking forward to all of our listeners buying your album and my album. Where can they purchase such recorded delights?
Oh man, the musings of one James Search. Where can you pick those up? You can get that at jimsearch.bandcamp.com. That is where you can pick up Upstate Understandings, my very first comedy album, produced by Rob Adler. I had a very great team around me, make that happen, and very excited to, have that available for you. So go buy a copy of it. If you buy one, buy another one, buy 3 of them. You know what I mean? Get these vinyls out of, the apartment I live in. So do that. Also, while you're at it, you can go to, jimsearchcomedy.com. You can look up all the cool show dates and whatnot. Got a very great show at Stellar Human, March 23rd. Stellar Presents. It's going to be a great show. Stephen Brown's hosting. Abdul Adi is going to be there as well. I'm going to headline it. And LaRue Simmons is going to be there too. So come on out for that. Rob, they've done all the things that I've asked them, right? They have, they being a dutiful, speedy freak that they are, they've done everything, that I said. But as you alluded to earlier, you may have something for them as well. Can you point them in the right direction to get them there?
I can. Whether you are canvassing Western New York, trying to peddle your snake oil to unwitting upstaters, or you're trying to plug all the orphaned wells, I've got the perfect music for you to get you from well to well or mark to mark. It's a little album called New York Sticky, and it's an instrumental album. It's just great music to have on, to hang out to chill to. You can find it at brooklynfrequency.bandcamp.com. Go check it out. And like Jim mentioned at the top of the show, don't forget to subscribe, rate, or review our show. I shouldn't say or, I should say and. Do all those things.
Yeah.
And if you review our show on Apple Podcasts, again, throw in a suggestion for your favorite topic. If you don't want to hear us talk about oil, give us a different upstate topic to look at, and we just might do it. On that note, Jim, I have figured out a way to sign us off today. If you're ready for it. I'm not quite ready, but if you are, I'll do it.
I'm ready. Let's see what we got.
All right. Well, we talked about oil today, and I just have one thing to say to you, Jim.
What's that?
I drink your milkshake. I drink it up.
Oh, Jesus. Holy moly.
That's a quote from the most famous oil-related movie. I don't know if it's for a specific crowd.
Yeah, it is. And you hit it, and you nailed it.
Hey, it ended in up. I had to do it.
All right, folks.
We are on that note, see ya.
Peace. Understanding Upstate is a podcast hosted by Jim Search and Rob Adler, edited by Rob Adler, and music from Regal Monk.